Hey everyone! In the last video, we left off with the fall of Babylon and the looming Bronze Age collapse. But since we really can't understand the Bronze Age collapse without looking at the entire region, I've decided to follow up the history of Mesopotamia with the history of Egypt. Now, we have this massive problem with Egyptian chronology, and it was created by a guy named Manetho. Just think about this for a second. Manetho was a court historian for the Ptolemies, living in the 3rd century BC. And since the Ptolemies were Greek, they honestly couldn't have cared less about Egyptian history. But still, they were a little bit curious about what exactly this country was that had fallen into their hands after Alexander the Great. So, Manetho gathered the Egyptian priests, pulled together whatever sources were lying around, and wrote a history of Egypt. Basically, he made a compilation. He tried to slap some sort of timeline onto it. The catch is, the ancient Egyptians never bothered to rationalize their history in that way. They really didn't care about making it neat and tidy. So Manetho took the easy way out. He looked at the 3,000 years of history before him and went, all right, 3,000 years, let's just divide it into 30 dynasties. Boom. Nice, beautiful, clean history. And this is hilarious because even today, the story so often starts with the first dynasty. Even though about 50 years ago, historians had to awkwardly introduce Dynasty Zero. And now they're increasingly having to introduce Dynasty 00, pushing things back another 200 years, just desperately trying to explain how Egypt actually formed in the first place. Take some basic things, for example. Why do I think it's absolutely necessary to talk about predynastic Egypt? Well, because writing actually emerged before the first dynasty. Now, today you're going to hear a lot of Greek names. We know exactly how to pronounce Greek names, but with Egyptian names, there's a bit of a problem when it comes to reading them. Take the famous goddess Isis. Actually, any feminine word in ancient Egyptian, just like in modern Coptic, its descendant, literally anything feminine, including names, always ends with a T, always. Like Sekhmet, Tefnut, and so on. So why does Isis sound like that? Simply because we actually don't know the exact pronunciation. It was probably pronounced something like Iset or something similar, but we can't fully reconstruct it. But in Greek, she was Isis. Same goes for Osiris or Horus. So let's start from the very beginning, specifically the last ice age, which ended, or let's say it started warming up, around 12 to 13,000 years ago. Basically, North Africa was an area without any glaciers. But because of the global cooling, all the water was locked up in ice. So, first of all, the level of the Mediterranean Sea dropped significantly. The ocean level dropped hard. And most importantly, half of Africa became completely uninhabitable. What you see here in dark brown on the map, that was an absolute hardcore desert, massive sand dunes, completely impassable, with a climate where nothing could survive. So during the Ice Age, North Africa was practically empty. There is almost no late Paleolithic or Mesolithic presence. Ice Age presence, let's call it, in Africa. It just doesn't exist. It's as if there were no people there at all. But everything comes to an end. The Ice Age ends too. Everything starts to melt. Water returns, flowing down from the Ethiopian highlands and everywhere else. The moment the climate slowly starts to improve here, people return. They start settling the land again. And what's more, Africa begins to transform. What you see highlighted in yellow here, these were grassy plains, a lush, healthy savanna. Not even the dried out savanna you're used to seeing today, but a proper, green, thriving ecosystem. This is what the Sahara looked like a couple of thousand years after the end of the Ice Age, when people come back here and start settling it all over again. They arrive, and these are basically, pre-Neolithic cultures. As a reminder, the Neolithic is the new Stone Age. Now, usually, everyone thinks the Stone Age just meant people sitting around dumbly smashing rocks against other rocks. Well, yeah, partly. But the Neolithic is actually a really interesting era. Stonework carving reached such an incredible level that people were actually making some really cool stuff, like awls, fish hooks, sickles, and everything else, and they made all of it out of stone. In Egypt, this stoneworking tradition goes all the way into the Old Kingdom. The Egyptians were always on a first name basis with stone. Plus, these are people who were actively into creating art, specifically petroglyphs and rock carvings. In the Nile Valley, and honestly just anywhere nearby, they really loved to draw. Today, in North Africa, we know of about 30,000 petroglyphs, and I'm counting the whole of North Africa here, including what was then the Green Sahara. Naturally, there were rivers flowing through it back then. Naturally, it had absolutely everything you needed. But the Nile, they had absolutely no interest in the Nile whatsoever, because the Nile, as a river, was something completely different back then. First of all, notice that there is no delta here. That characteristic triangle shape. By the way, what exactly is a delta? It's a letter in the Greek alphabet, an upside-down triangle with the point at the bottom. The Nile used to flow straight into the Mediterranean Sea with no delta at all, and it was incredibly powerful because water was rushing down from the mountains where all those glaciers were melting. So, during its flood season, the Nile hit with such a massive, violent surge of water that living on its banks was simply, well, physically unsafe. Even this map doesn't fully show the scale of it. Here, by the way, you can see the riverbed of the Nile, but actually, it had these massive branches shooting off to the sides. Today, those are just dry gorges. They usually aren't even drawn on maps. There's an Arabic word, wadi, and that's exactly what they call these dry gorges, left over from the ancient branches of the Nile. Imagine this. There were these branches stretching out from the sides of the Nile, reaching almost all the way to the Red Sea. It spread out much wider than it does today. And, of course, it carried way more water. And you had elephants living here, giraffes, antelopes, and hippos, obviously. Basically, all of the African megafauna was still roaming right here in the Sahara. Well, okay, maybe not the entire Sahara, but in the Libyan desert, we absolutely have rock art depicting elephants, giraffes, and all the rest of it. So, yeah, zebras were literally running around here. Overall, it was a fantastic place to live. Great hunting, plenty of food. But since people were getting more advanced, they started trying to do things themselves. For example, they tamed the aurochs here. You might know this. Modern cows are actually the descendants of tamed aurochs. The wild aurochs itself is extinct now. Right now, as you can see in this photo, people are actually trying to breed them back, through selective breeding. They're trying to resurrect the exact same aurochs that was domesticated back then. So, here's the thing. The Egyptians, or rather not the Egyptians, but the ancient North African tribes, they were among the very few to domesticate the aurochs completely independently, completely separate from the Middle East, and that was a huge help. So let's just say they were already engaging in a kind of animal husbandry, even if it wasn't super focused just yet. Mostly, they just dragged cows around with them, and it was purely for backup. If something went wrong, like if they couldn't manage to catch any antelopes because the herds migrated somewhere else, well, you could always use the cows as your backup grub, and naturally, these folks were into gathering. This is exactly where that flint sickle we talked about comes in. Basically, if they stumbled upon some wild sorghum or wild wheat, the ancient undomesticated varieties, they could just slice it down, gather it up, and walk away. But again, these were not people who practiced agriculture. I mean, why would you? It grows by itself. You show up, you cut it, and you leave. When you come back the next year, boom, it grew back in the wild all on its own. There was absolutely zero incentive to sit there and cultivate or plant anything, none. Hunting took up a much more important part of their lives than all this gathering nonsense. And this is actually incredibly telling. Look at the Middle East. When agricultural cultures start popping up over there, they gradually begin to stockpile food surpluses. And from that surplus, a power structure emerges. Then, to maintain that massive food supply in Mesopotamia, they have to invent irrigation. They have to start digging little canals. Nothing like that happens in Egypt. The guys here are just hunting. We're talking about many different cultures, not just one single nation. And they feel absolutely fantastic. They run around this territory, they hunt, and honestly, I just love what this whole period is called. For this specific region, they sometimes use a much more poetic, beautiful term, the Neolithic subpluvial or the Neolithic rains. The very first truly conscious agriculture only starts here around 6000 BC. And these were people who were trying to farm, but it was incredibly primitive and honestly pretty boring. There's really not much to say about them. They certainly didn't live any better than the hunters. In fact, at that point in time, those early farmers were basically the losers of their era. They were the guys who couldn't fight for the really sweet, luxurious pastures or the good hunting grounds. So they were forced to hide in the corners and grow their little patches of grass. When we look at any of the developed cultures from that era across today's territory, we see one thing clearly. They were not tied to the Nile at all. So, for example, take the people who built Nabta Playa and the areas where they roamed. Today, that whole region is just a dead desert. It's completely uninhabitable. There is absolutely no one there. And yet, back then, there were people hanging around who were actively into making little drawings, various rock art. But what's really important for us are their megalithic complexes somewhere way up the Nile. Actually, I should probably mention this just so people don't get confused. Please remember that the Nile flows incorrectly. Well, it flows downwards. You see, there is the White Nile and the Blue Nile. These two rivers merge, join into a single Nile, and then the Nile flows north straight into the Mediterranean Sea. So, yeah, I just feel like I need to clarify that so people understand that the Nile is kind of wrong in that sense. When we say Lower Egypt, we actually mean the delta in the north. And when we talk about the Upper Nile or Upper Egypt, we mean the Nile Valley further south. Everything leading up to the first cataract, the second cataract, and so on. Oh, and regarding the megaliths, what's fascinating is that these people were creating these megalithic complexes way back then. Basically, if you take the position of the star Sirius around 6000 BC, these stones were aligned exactly to point right at it, which means these guys were actively observing, the sky. They were genuinely interested in it. So, yeah, up there in the upper reaches of the Nile, you really did have some highly developed cultures. And most likely, this was exactly that kind of center, a place where tribes gathered to observe the stars, sit around, discuss things, maybe divide up hunting territories, establish some common symbols, things like that. But isn't it interesting? Even back then, they were already tracking Sirius. And Sirius would go on to become the central star of all of Egypt, primarily because of the water cycles that would later define the Nile, and civilization would eventually come to Egypt from that exact same direction. In Upper Egypt, progress happened much faster. Now, do we have any hard proof that these people were the direct ancestors of future Egypt? No, we don't. But what if they were? It would be incredibly fascinating. And honestly, we have no evidence against it either, at least in terms of cultural baggage, knowledge they could have passed down to each other, sharing discoveries and traditions. Now, somewhere around the 5th millennium BC, and you can imagine the precision of these dates, around this time, technical innovations from Mesopotamia finally started penetrating the Nile Valley, basically from the Fertile Crescent. Because while the Egyptians were just stewing in their own juices, actual cities were already emerging in the Middle East. Over there, we already had the Ubaid culture, the ancestor of the Sumerian civilization. So over there, everything was developed on a much more hardcore level. Their technologies for making pottery, for making various tools, even for hunting, were far superior, and these technologies were brought over here. It got to the point where the Egyptians were copying the shapes of Mesopotamian pottery exactly, one to one. Maybe it was people who migrated over, or maybe they just taught the locals, passing on their knowledge. But either way, this more advanced technology, especially when it came to growing barley and all that stuff, it was not invented in Egypt. You also have to understand that for a long time, Egypt borrowed absolutely everything from the Middle East. Basically, migrants from the Middle East brought enlightenment, the light of technology, and along with that wild sorghum and all those ridiculous, absurd crops the locals were desperately trying to grow in Egypt, they brought real agriculture. Now, right around this time, the delta finally appeared. And how did it form? Well, as the climate warmed, the ocean level kept rising and rising and rising until the Mediterranean Sea got so high that it started flooding back into this area. So instead of a rushing river, the area turned into a massive swamp. The Nile spread out into dozens of little branches, creating a giant marshland. Now, swamps are terrible for people, but they are great for one thing in particular, a plant called papyrus, which grew here in massive quantities. Papyrus is basically the defining feature of Lower Egypt, the delta. They taught them bad habits, as the saying goes. Around this same time, various Middle Eastern technologies were introduced to the Merimde culture, the domestication of ducks, goats, sheep. All of this appears very suddenly, practically overnight, so it was definitely borrowed. But what's really funny is that the Egyptians borrowed barley with absolute fanaticism for one very simple reason. Imagine this. You're constantly storing the grain you harvest. You keep it in your little cellar. Then, once again, the Nile overflows its banks and floods your cellar. It gets nice and damp in there, and your barley starts to sprout. Today, we call that sprouted barley malt. It turned out that if it sprouted and you added some more water, the starch converts to sugar. The whole mess starts fermenting, and boom, you can brew beer out of it. And damn it, the Egyptians drank beer like there was no tomorrow. Even though beer was most likely invented in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians became the number one brewers in the village. And by village, I mean the entire ancient world. The Egyptians were legendary beer guzzlers, to the point where, when we look at their mummies, and remember, they preserved the organs separately during embalming, honestly, practically all of them had cirrhosis of the liver. Yeah, the priests actually had to drink more because it was a religious duty. Sacrifices to certain gods were made through the priest, meaning the priest consumes the offerings and the god supposedly gets full. If you think about it, this is most likely connected to their deep fear of death. We'll talk about this a lot more when we eventually cover the Old Kingdom, the guys who started building the pyramids and all that, because the fear of death is essentially the defining feature of the Egyptians. It defines their entire culture. The fear of death drips from all their myths. The fear of death is in all their burials. And basically, you react to this fear of death in one of two ways. The first way, you secure a decent afterlife for yourself using incredibly complex tombs, elaborate rituals, embalming, and so on. But that's only for the elite. And the elite was never more than 2 or 3% of the population in Egypt. That's nonsense for the rest of them. So, what did the vast majority do? The majority just chugged beer and played music. Egyptians absolutely loved music and beer. As for burying the commoners, they just dug a hole in the sand, tossed them in facing west, and called it a day. That's it. And that's the entire burial ritual for your average Egyptian. At that time, and remember, we are talking about the period around 5000 BC, what's characteristic is that there is still no social stratification in Egypt whatsoever. I mean, all the dwellings are exactly the same, and yet these people are already crafting all sorts of figurines. If you ask me, that's a pretty decent level of creativity. This is the Merimde culture. They even buried their dead right next to themselves. They didn't even have a separate cemetery. Wherever they lived, they just buried their dead right there. That's how unique their worldview was. And by the way, this also applies to religion, especially in the African sense. This whole totemism, fetishism, where does it come from? It comes from the idea that you have a totem, meaning your friend. A totem is not some supreme being. It's not like later on when you have the goddess Bastet, who is a cat, and we pray to her. No, it means a totemic animal. Like a turtle, for instance, it is a part of the tribe. It's our friend. We live together with it, we hunt together with it, and therefore the turtle favors us. And so we are sort of one with nature. But the turtle is, first and foremost, a totem, our friend. They could literally sit this carved wooden totem at the table with them, take it hunting, and so on. That's the whole point. The totem is a part of the tribe. And only later does it start to stand out. Maybe a special reverence develops. Someone walks by and kicks the totem. How dare you? That's sacrilege. And so a more careful attitude and worship emerge. And then it grows into something bigger. Or maybe it doesn't. People move on to other forms, and they just consider their former totem to be a manifestation of some god or something else. And of course, you are constantly being washed away by floods and all that. So, the Nile Delta and Lower Egypt in general is still quite poorly explored by archaeologists, because this is the time when the Nile begins forming its famous alluvial deposits. In the spring, the Ethiopian highlands begin to melt. All sorts of waters rush down from there, feeding the White and the Blue Nile. These waters come rushing in. Everything overflows its banks. The Nile floods and spreads out. After that, the water recedes, leaving behind incredibly rich soils. These brown, almost red soils, you could say, that the river carried all the way from the depths of Africa, the so-called alluvial deposits. Now, since the time we're talking about, these deposits have built up to about 10 meters deep in Upper Egypt and a massive 50 meters deep in Lower Egypt in the delta. That's exactly why, if any cultures got washed away and buried back then, digging down to them today is incredibly difficult. So, maybe in the future, more things will be uncovered during excavations. But right now, these layers are simply insurmountable. They lie beneath massive, thick layers of earth, so it's really hard to say what those people actually had. Therefore, for the most part, if we have any excavations in Lower Egypt, they are usually just around the edges, on the fringes, or from a much later period. Anyway, religiously, it looked pretty creepy. Just imagine a person comes out, looks up, and right in the middle of summer, bam, the star Sirius has completely disappeared from the sky. It's just gone. And then every single year on July 17th, the star Sirius reappears. And literally the day after it shows up, the water starts rising. Water that is blood red in color, followed by even more water, but this time it's green. That's all the vegetation getting washed down, churning up leaves and plants. Then come the next waves, and eventually everything starts to calm down, and the water recedes. The disaster has passed. How do you explain that? What just happened? Well, evidently, someone's head got chopped off first, hence the red water. After that, maybe they pieced him back together, using green herbs to heal him. And maybe when it rained, it was Isis weeping over the body of her murdered brother. But that comes later. Right now, at this point in time, we are still talking mostly about totemism, not these highly developed religious concepts. And of course, there's another thing you need to understand about the Nile. Aside from the usual dangers, like the Nile flooding and simply drowning you, the Nile was teeming with crocodiles. And crocodiles were naturally very important animals. They were arrogant, brazen predators. I mean, even when Napoleon's army landed in Egypt millennia later, they had problems with soldiers being eaten by crocodiles. So in ancient times, suddenly having a crocodile crawl out and devour you was a totally normal, everyday occurrence. Later on, when the Egyptians invented their writing system, they actively used euphemisms, substitutions. Instead of writing that someone was a bad person, they would literally just draw a crocodile. To them, evil crocodiles was the term for all bad people. Now, with every passing century and millennium, Egypt was becoming more and more fertile because the river kept depositing more of this incredible soil. But this had a flip side. The longer it went on, the more the Nile actually calmed down. Once the Great Melt was over, things got more peaceful. By the 6th and 5th millennia BC, it was getting much calmer, and once the delta formed, the river just lazily spread out. So the waters here were relatively peaceful. I mean, not during the actual flood, obviously, but during the agricultural year. It was a calm, predictable cycle, super predictable. Like I said, you could calculate the exact day the floods would start. The only thing you couldn't calculate was how massive the flood would be. For that, sorry, it's just the luck of the draw. But think about this situation. You don't need to dig any canals. You don't need to unite the people and put a boss in charge to say, all right, you guys dig here and I'll sit here and watch you dig. For a very long time, those reasons for unification simply did not exist in the Nile Valley. The water started rising. Okay, you just packed up, went to the hills, and lived on your hills. The water went away, you came back down, and you just walk out there, and you don't even need to swing a hoe. Seriously, you just toss your seeds onto the ground. One guy walks along throwing seeds, and a second guy drives cows right behind him. The cow walks along, steps on the seed with its hoof, and pushes it into the soil. And that's it. You just sit back, chill, and wait for it to grow. And yet, you are harvesting absolutely insane crop yields. For context, if you look at the Russian Empire, basically up until the 19th century, a yield of 1 to 3, meaning you plant 100 kilos and harvest 300. That was considered a normal harvest. If you got 1 to 4, you threw a party. If you got 1 to 5, you were like, we're selling tons abroad this year, we're gonna be rich. Even in a very bad year, the Nile gave a yield of 1 to 20. Because alluvial soil is quite simply the most fertile type of soil that can possibly exist. The only other place with soil that fertile is India. That's it. Well, maybe in a few spots in China, but there's much less of it there. But still, what tastes better? Emmer wheat or an elephant? An elephant tastes better, obviously. So, as long as there was a savanna all around, as long as it was livable, people stayed. But this amazing situation, it also comes to an end sooner or later, namely, the warming continues. At some point, it gets so warm that things stop being so great. It actually gets a little dry. And the lush savanna first turns into just a regular savanna, then into some half-dead steppe. And then the process of the Sahara drying up begins, the process of aridification, meaning everything starts to dry out. First of all, those river branches and gorges dry up. They've been gone for a very long time now. You could still wander around the savannah for a long while, but desertification was starting here too, especially around, say, 4,500–4,000 years BC. These processes really start hitting the people hard, and they start leaving. And where do they go? From their dying pastures. Well, it's pretty obvious. They start migrating to the Nile. Now, the population of the Nile Valley was still very sparse at that point because if you want to practice agriculture, well, we've discussed this. Yes, it is still pretty hard work, even the kind we just described. I mean, when I say you just throw seeds, a cow walks by and you're done? No, obviously, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Let's not have anyone suddenly thinking it was actually that easy. No, of course not. Even that regime, even with the incredibly favorable Nile soil, still requires effort. It still requires, for example, basin irrigation, meaning you don't want the Nile to just drain away immediately. So you, like a bunch of beavers, start building dams. When the Nile floods, you create these little catchments to hold the water so you can release it later, effectively extending the Nile's flood period. But either way, this is a much more ecological method. In the Indus Valley and in Mesopotamia, they practice irrigation that simply kills the soil. Because if you constantly irrigate the soil from the outside like that, well, you pour the water gets absorbed and evaporates. But the mineral salts it brought with it, they stay behind. And over time, the soil becomes salinized. Take the Harappan civilization, for example, where it used to be. Today, that's Pakistan. That's exactly what happened there. But once upon a time, it blossomed, it produced, and it was basically not just a country, but a living, breathing garden. And that's the gist of it. As the climate kept warming and the Sahara inevitably dried up, the once nomadic hunters and gatherers were forced out of their dying savannas and pushed right to the banks of the Nile. This ecological shift changed absolutely everything. In the next video, we're going to talk about exactly this transition, how people moved from simply gathering wild crops to actually settling down and building real organized agricultural societies in the region.